Welcome back to our series on the history of queer representation in media. This week, we're taking a deep dive into speculative fiction and the massive, mostly positive impact it has had within the LGBTQ+ community over the last few decades. Before we start, it's important to note that speculative fiction as a whole is a literary supergenre, which encompasses a number of different genres of fiction, each with speculative elements that are based on conjecture and do not exist, I repeat, do not exist, in the real world. Now, if we were to cover this topic with every single subgenre that falls under the speculative fiction umbrella, we'd be here for literal days. For this video, we are only highlighting LGBTQ+ themes specifically within the realms of science fiction, fantasy, horror fiction, cyberpunk fiction, and a little dabble into superhero fiction. We really just needed to clarify some boundaries so that the steampunk stans don't come for us. That's a video for another day. Now that we've got some ground rules, let's dive in. So let's start with a basic question. What is speculative fiction anyway? Speculative fiction has been around since before Orson Welles' infamously narrated War of the Worlds over radio broadcast in 1938, and well before Star Wars Episode 4 was released in theaters in July of 1978. In fact, speculative fiction has actually been a documented source of entertainment for the human race from antiquity, and it makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Humans have written about hypothetical events surrounding our reality since we developed the written word. Wondering about what lies beyond our human understanding is a natural consequence of the human condition. Speculative fiction can be dated back to ancient Greece, when playwrights like Euripides explored alternate versions of the truth. The origins of science fiction are controversial, but we can pinpoint a few select works as the intentional start of the genre. In 1616, German theologian Johann Valentin Andrea published The Chemical Wedding, predating Johann Kepler's novel Somnium, which was written in 1608 but not published until 1634. The science of the chemical wedding is late Renaissance alchemy, which had the same fascination for readers of the time as the scientific possibilities of classic science fiction did in its last century heyday. However, some experts in the field are not entirely convinced. There are lots of 16th century utopias and dystopias, which I'd say have a better claim to being science fiction than The Chemical Wedding. Thomas More's Utopia was first published in 1516, after all, said Adam Roberts, professor at Royal Holloway and science fiction novelist. There are two broad camps of thought, one that identifies the genre's roots in early fantastical works, such as the Sumerian Epic of Gilgamesh, earliest Sumerian text versions dated to 2150 to 2000 BCE. A second approach argues that science fiction only became possible sometime between the 17th and early 19th centuries, following the scientific revolution and major discoveries in astronomy, physics, and mathematics. There is, however, one work widely considered to be the first undisputed intentional science fiction story, which came centuries after both Utopia and The Chemical Wedding. That is none other than Mary Shelley's critically acclaimed and famous novel, Frankenstein, published in 1818. Novelists, historians, and sci-fi nerds alike have argued that Frankenstein is the first science fiction novel because its fantastic events occur not because of magic, miracle, or alchemy, but purely through science. What makes books like Frankenstein fascinating is not just that they reflect the new science of the time, but that they demonstrate literature's influence on scientific inquiry. In more modern societies, speculative fiction has given writers and readers the freedom to imagine societies that are different from reality as a means to escape oppressive systems. When we look at modern speculative fiction, we have to begin our story in the 1960s. And look, we know that it's a very wide jump from 1818, and we're casually breezing past some of the most prolific speculative fiction writers like H.P. Lovecraft, Isaac Asimov, and H.G. Wells. In order for us to understand the genre from the queer lens, it's important to begin with this era, known as the New Wave era for speculative fiction. This period gave way to a boom in media consumption rife with political, racial, sexual, and gender-related societal change. It was the perfect petri dish for speculative fiction to bloom and intersect with LGBTQ+ communities in a major way. To put a magnifying glass over the growing world of speculative fiction in this era, we have to consider the time we were in. The women's rights movements, also called women's liberation movement, was ramping up in the US in the 1960s and 70s. At the time, women were seeking equal rights and opportunities and greater personal freedoms. It coincided with and is recognized as part of the second wave of feminism. This movement allowed science fiction to serve as a kind of social laboratory for visionaries like Ursula K Le Guin, Margaret Atwood, and Octavia Butler. The freedom of world building within speculative fiction allowed these authors to question reality in radical ways. Feminist authors of the era didn't turn to writing utopias as a way of accomplishing activist aims. They did so more because it gave them space to explore real gender issues and to think about fundamental questions in gender relations. Until this time in history, speculative fiction and science fiction in particular was dominated by male writers and male readers. By the 1970s, it had become a safe space in which women could reach a new audience interested in science and thought experiments to get their point across. Feminism was, and still is, a whole set of complex, interrelated ideas, and individual writers can't always say in a straightforward way, I'm a feminist, or I'm writing a feminist story. Yet, science fiction as a genre was favored by feminist authors. They gave up the narrative momentum of the dystopia, with its spectacular conflicts and dark threats, in favor of the more static and didactic form of the utopia, a world that allows them to explore, create, and experiment on their own terms. One of the greatest science fiction authors to come out of this era was Ursula K Le Guin, whose name is often the sole female one on lists of the best or greatest science fiction fantasy writers of the 20th century. The genre of science fiction fantasy that Le Guin devised was one women and LGBTQ people were begging for, a world in which women were powerful, a world in which gender was fluid, and a world in which there was only strength in being female or gender nonconforming. Before Le Guin, women were largely peripheral to science fiction and fantasy. There were few such books by women and fewer still for women readers. Le Guin herself explained her earliest work was male-centered and her influences were all male. Women and gender nonconforming individuals were highlighted by Le Guin in her works. Le Guin was determined to include people who had been excluded from the genre since its inception. Her most famous work, The Left Hand of Darkness, published in 1969, is a sci-fi tour de force, and at its core, a story about connection, and the difficulty of communicating and building relationships with other people. Of the book, Le Guin said, I eliminated gender to find out what was left. She spoke often in interviews over the years that she wanted to reflect what was true, that the world was majority female and non-white. The Left Hand of Darkness, for which Le Guin won both the Hugo and Nebula Awards, gave us a world beyond gender, a world in which gender is so fluid among the ambisexual Gathinian inhabitants of the planet Winter, it is not needed for survival or even convenience. This novel, which solidified her as one of the greatest writers of the genre, staked out new ground. This story went well beyond Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land, to a wholly new and different, and for some, uncomfortable place. What does it mean if men are allowed to be effeminate and women masculine? What does it mean if anyone can become pregnant, a state men have been grateful to have avoided for millennia? What does it mean if gender does not drive a people or a planet and there is no endless war? Even raising these questions was stunning, but to assert it would mean a better, more productive, more peaceful world? Yet here, over 50 years since Le Guin published the novel, these same issues are in the political foreground on a daily basis and have become a staple in American politics. While Le Guin was a straight cis white woman, it's easy to see how her work from the period paved the way for the queer experience within the speculative fiction genre. Another prolific speculative fiction author of the period, who also happened to be a woman, was Octavia E Butler. Now, there's some controversy around Octavia's sexual identity. Some obituaries claim she was a lesbian, while some of her closest friends said she was bisexual, asexual, a lesbian, and even straight. Will we ever know how Octavia identified herself? Probably not, and it doesn't really matter in this context. What we do know is that Octavia E Butler stood out in a field dominated by white men and white women at the time. Her talent to capture the African-American, female, and queer experience in a turbulent period of civil rights marches, feminist protests, and the Stonewall riots under the guise of science fiction was a monumental shift in the world of speculative fiction for authors and readers alike. At the time, she along with Samuel R. Delany were two of the only African-American sci-fi writers with any visibility. Until the 21st century, she was one of the only black women writing in the genre. In a piece for Library of America, she said, "As far as I know, I'm still the only black woman who does this." A young black woman once said to me, "I always wanted to write science fiction, but I didn't think there were any black women doing it." And even while she was alive, Butler was not only just a successful author, but a painfully obvious argument for why representation matters in allowing future generations to feel that they too can do something. It was subversive in Butler's day, and remains so now, to depict nuanced relationships between humans and other species that cross into the territory of the sensual, if not the romantic. Yet Butler was unsparing in her exploration of what it would be like to truly live with someone, or something, entirely unlike ourselves on the surface. In much of her work, Butler shows that it is possible to form multi-layered relationships with the other, in any form. Human, vampire, colossal intelligent insect, alien colony, etc. You get the point. No matter how different we appear, we may be able to live together and not only coexist, but cooperate, if not cohabitate. we may even shockingly come to love this coexistence. Butler's preferred relationship structure in her stories was mutualism, whereby each member benefited from the other, though in reality there were often complicated power dynamics at play. Speculative fiction is a useful means of examining sexual bias by forcing the reader to reconsider their heteronormative cultural assumptions. It has also been claimed by critics, such as fellow LGBTQ author Nicola Griffith, that queer readers identify strongly with the science fiction elements of the genre, including mutants, aliens, and other outsider characters. An alien stepping into our world, Butler mused in the monophobic response, a brief but memorable speech on science fiction might well sadly be the sole thing that unites us. Perhaps for a moment, only a moment, Butler wrote of the prospect of a real-life alien invasion, this affront will bring us together, all humanity, all much more alike than different. In the beautifully resonant final sentence of the essay, she asked, what will be born of that brief, strange, and ironic union? In a time where we as human beings seem more profoundly disunited than ever, her final question still echoes. Yet her fiction comes close to posing the complex answers, presenting worlds in which difference and sameness are never simple propositions, but the foundations for remarkable, robust new relationships. Butler called out bigotry unflinchingly. She also imagined futures in which we have so thoroughly dismissed the crude prejudices of racism, sexism, and anti-queerness that we can learn to embrace that which seems other, such that it ceases to be other at all. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, science fiction and fantasy began to reflect the changes prompted by the civil rights movement and the emergence of a counterculture. Within the genres, these changes were incorporated into a movement known to be called the New Wave era, more skeptical of technology, more liberated socially, and more interested in stylistic experimentation. New Wave writers were more likely to claim an interest in inner space instead of outer space. They were less shy about explicit sexuality and more sympathetic to reconsiderations of gender roles and the social status of sexual minorities. Under the influence of New Wave editors and authors such as Michael Moorcock, editor of the influential New Worlds, sympathetic depictions of alternative sexuality and gender multiplied in science fiction and fantasy, becoming commonplace even. The introduction of gay imagery has been attributed to the influence of lesbian, feminist, and gay liberation movements in the 1960s. In the 1970s, lesbians and gay men became a more visible presence in the speculative fiction community and as writers, as other notable gay authors included Joanna Russ, Thomas M. Dish, and Samuel R. Delany. It was very clear that the world was changing, seen unwaveringly through the eyes of science fiction and fantasy authors. Due to the decades-long standing Hays Code being abolished in 1968, we were finally about to see this change make its first appearance on screen as well. While queer world-building was beginning to take hold in science fiction literature, we also began to see a rise in science fiction television on our screens at home. Actually, television viewership as a whole saw a major boom in the decade. In the year 1960, the average daily household radio use in the US had dropped to less than 2 hours, while TV viewership had climbed to more than 5 hours per day for the average household. We've spoken at length before on how television access over the earlier decades of the 20th century had a major impact on the content that was being produced. For the first 50 years of the 1900s, network studios and writers alike were battling against time and censors. By the 1960s, however, the Hays Code had been abolished, opening up the space to really explore what lies beyond human limitations. This, of course, led to more films and shows venturing into science fiction and fantasy. Doctor Who aired its first episode in 1963 in the UK. Star Trek aired its first episode in 1966 in the US, and even the kids got their first taste of science fiction with 1962's airing of The Jetsons. When the 70s and 80s rolled around, we had Battlestar Galactica in 1974 and 3 films in the Star Wars franchise to contend with. While most of these science fiction blockbusters didn't initially set out with the intent to include queer storylines, the creators and actors of the franchises found a way to include queer issues and characters into the mix over time as society changed around them. In fact, Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry once spoke of overcoming his own homophobia. In a 1991 interview in The Humanist, he remarked, "My attitude towards homosexuality has changed. I came to the conclusion that I was wrong. I was never someone who hunted down, as we used to call them on the street. I would sometimes say something anti-homosexual off the top of my head because it was thought in those days to be funny. I never really deeply believed those comments, but I gave the impression of being thoughtless in these areas. I have, over many years, changed my attitude about gay men and women." The Star Trek franchise has always been known to push the boundaries of what is acceptable on mainstream television. And one of the ways it has done this is with explorations of LGBTQ+ themes. Star Trek, the original series, debuted in 1966, in a decade where a lot of social norms were in flux. The topics of race, gender, and sexuality were all being brought to the forefront of the public consciousness, and TOS began the tradition of using episodes to hold a mirror up to the social and political issues of the day. Following in the footsteps of TOS, every Star Trek iteration has gotten bolder and better at pushing the boundaries of addressing outdated prejudices. It's worth noting that while TOS was a trendsetter in its storylines about race and gender politics, the show never had any explicit representation of queer characters, and neither did Star Trek The Next Generation. Though the Hays Code was gone, networks were still a little bit squeamish about upsetting the straights and the white suburban household viewers. There were a considerable number of established rules about what was and was not regarded as acceptable to show on network television. The original series got away with a lot that the network may not have wanted to show, like the infamous interracial kiss, as did subsequent series thereafter. But it's only in the last decade that any explicitly LGBTQ+ characters have featured in the Star Trek franchise. This fact may seem like it refutes the idea that Star Trek has any kind of queer history, but stick with us here. Star Trek is the real-life version of X walked so Y could run. While explicit representation is very important, the Star Trek universe had historically not needed to be overtly queer in order to still be tied to the LGBTQ+ community. Whether through LGBTQ+ actors, the exploration of sociological and political themes, or by garnering the interest of queer fans who have felt a connection with certain characters, Star Trek has a woven thread of queerness that can be followed throughout the majority of its history. While the original series didn't explicitly include LGBTQ+ main characters, George Takei, who played helmsman Hikaru Sulu, came out as gay in 2005. Takei has been a visible and active member of the LGBTQ+ community and champion of LGBTQ+ rights, for which he's known by even younger generations of sci-fi fans. Sulu was a main character on TOS. It's important we acknowledge that a gay Asian man had visibility in an important on-screen role, when just 20 years prior, Takei and his family were forced into Rower internment camp along with approximately 120,000 other Japanese Americans who were placed in camps solely because of their Japanese ethnicity. Additionally, the original series saw the creation of a fan community that became drawn to two characters for what they perceived as the character's queer subtext, namely Captain James T. Kirk and his first officer, Spock. The fandom that sprung up around Kirk and Spock is credited with the origins of slash fiction. Slash is when fans create writing or art that depicts two male or two female characters from a specific piece of media in a same-sex relationship. The name slash comes from the backslash that is often added between the two characters' names to denote them as a couple, i.e. Kirk/Spock. Despite never being an actual couple on the show, Kirk and Spock were portrayed as one by fans in a number of fanzines that were passed around via mail during the 1970s, the precursor to current online fan communities. Whether the queer subtext between Kirk and Spock was intentional or not, the two characters are inextricably linked to the LGBTQ+ community for people who know their history. Similar to the original series, The Next Generation, which ran from 1987 to 1994, had no explicit LGBTQ+ main characters. One episode of the series, however, stands out as a compelling allegory for queer issues. Season 7, Episode 17, titled The Outcast, tells the story of the Enterprise crew encountering a group of aliens called the Xena, from a planet where binary gender does not exist. Sound familiar? The Xena all identify as gender neutral, and anyone who harbors feelings of being either male or female is considered deviant and sick by society. During the course of the episode, Commander Riker works very closely with a Xena named Soren, who reveals to him that she identifies as female. True to Riker's romancing skills, the two become close and begin a romantic relationship. But when they are discovered, Soren is immediately put before a hearing to decide her fate, where she makes an impassioned plea for herself and people like her to be treated better by Xenai's society. "It is not unnatural," she tells her people. "I am not sick because I feel this way. I do not need to be helped. I do not need to be cured." Soren's speech during her hearing is a powerful and poignant message about the plights of those deemed different from the rest of society. And for those in the LGBTQ+ community watching this episode of The Next Generation when it first aired in 1992, her words must have hit home in some very meaningful ways. Sadly, they were not enough to save Soren from undergoing treatment that cured her inclinations towards femininity. A tragic end such as this one was the longtime norm for most queer characters on television and in movies, but despite this, the show still uses the outcast to push the boundaries with regards to gender and sexuality, showcasing the plight of LGBTQ+ people during the early 90s. Additionally, in a 1990 episode, The Offspring, Data creates an android daughter, and the other crew members seek to explain humanoid sexuality to her. According to TNG research consultant Richard Arnold, Whoopi Goldberg refused to deliver her character's dialogue with a strictly heterosexual explanation. According to the script, Guinan was supposed to start telling Lal, "When a man and a woman are in love," and in the background there would be men and women sitting at tables holding hands. But Whoopi refused to say that. She said, "This show is beyond that. It should be when two people are in love." The Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum even has exhibitions based around Star Trek and the queer identity, due to its contributions within the space over the last few decades. And we'll get to the later Star Trek series in this video, so do not worry. This reevaluation of classic science fiction series has prompted many other lasting franchises to take a look at their own canon. In recent years, there's been a little bit of a kerfuffle over Lando Calrissian's character in the original Star Wars, and we know a lot of Star Wars fans can be, passionate, so we'll be delicate with this one. 2018's Solo: A Star Wars Story starred Donald Glover as a much younger version of Billy D. Williams' underworld smuggler and gambler Lando. Although the film wasn't exactly the biggest hit, Glover's portrayal received a lot of praise. He was clearly the movie's star in all but name, at least as far as fans and critics were concerned. Sorry, Han. There was more to it, though. Fans and critics alike had a hard time not noticing blatant flirting and sexual tension between Han and Lando in the film. So much so that the Solo writers went on record to delve more into the identity of Lando's sexuality. In an interview with Huffington Post, Solo co-writer Jonathan Kasdan made it clear he viewed Lando as pansexual, and wanted his motives to be left up to sexy interpretation. "There's a fluidity to Donald and Billy D's portrayal of Lando's sexuality," Kasdan told HuffPost after answering yes when asked if Lando was pansexual. "I mean, I would have loved to have gotten a more explicitly LGBT character into this movie. I think it's time, certainly, for that. And I love that fluidity, sort of the spectrum of sexuality that Donald appeals to and that droids are a part of." Kasdan's co-writer and father, Lawrence Kasdan, was more ambiguous in his response. When asked about the moment in the movie when L3 jokes about Lando's flirty attitude towards Han, Lawrence said, "That's her personality. Maybe it means something, maybe it doesn't." Kasdan clearly meant his comment to be an affirmation of queer identity, but the fact that no character in the Star Wars movie narrative is officially queer makes his position a tricky one. On one hand, suggesting to fans that Lando is queer without actually delivering on that promise is a deeply regressive move, commonly referred to as queer baiting. Yeah, we all know it. But on the other hand, in terms of the history of Star Wars fandom, even this level of overt attention to a non-heterosexual identity is a jaw-dropping evolution for the franchise. In essence, pansexual Lando is a sign of how drastically Star Wars' attitude towards its fandom has evolved. Glover himself seemed to semi-confirm this during a cast interview on Sirius. Glover himself weighed in, confirming that he was aware of Lando's sexuality. Furthermore, he posed this vital question: how can you not be pansexual in space? If the New Wave era was the spark that gave way to speculative fiction merely existing within queer identity, the 1990s went bolder with full-on fireworks. Following its publication in 1952, the novel Springfire, now considered to have launched the genre of lesbian pulp fiction, became an instant sensation, selling over 1.5 million copies. Its author, Mary Jane Meeker, later described her shock when she received countless letters about the book from queer women. Springfire was not aimed at any lesbian market because there wasn't any that we knew about. That was the first time anyone was aware of the gay audience out there. The book focused on a college freshman who falls for her sorority sister, and, well, ends the way most early portrayals of queer people did, in tragedy. When their love affair is discovered, one girl is sent to a mental institution and the other rejects her homosexual feelings. Dorothy Allison, whose 1992 novel Bastard Out of Carolina was a finalist for the National Book Award, credited the proliferation of LGBT bookstores with shaping her work and her life. The Oscar Wilde Memorial Bookshop, the oldest gay bookshop in the United States and quite possibly the first such bookshop anywhere, opened in the fall of 1967 at 291 Mercer Street in New York City, in Greenwich Village near New York University. It wasn't until the 90s that gay literature had its own section within bookstores that didn't cater specifically to the queer community. At the time, the genre was predominantly filled with anthologies and speculative fiction works. It may seem like a small act, but when it was still illegal to marry someone of the same sex, it's a pretty big deal. Television was also experiencing its own queer renaissance to a certain degree. We've spoken at length before about animation and anime and how the 90s allowed for better representation of the LGBTQ+ community. The same can be said for the science fiction and comics at the time. One of the biggest television shows to come out of the decade was Xena, Warrior Princess. At the time, the show was considered groundbreaking by starring a strong female action heroine, and was the only popular adventure, action, science fiction, or fantasy show that featured female leads without male counterparts. It's been credited by many, including Buffy the Vampire Slayer creator Joss Whedon, with blazing the trail for a new generation of female action heroes. Xena and Gabrielle's relationship has been cited as one of the reasons why the series has been so popular, though that journey has been a bit convoluted over the years. Shortly after the 1995 debut of the action fantasy series about a woman warrior seeking redemption for a dark past, fans pretty immediately started discussing the possibility of a relationship between Xena and her sidekick and, quote, best friend, Gabrielle. Toward the end of the first season, the show's producers began to play to this perception by deliberately inserting lesbian innuendo into some episodes. The show acquired a cult following in the lesbian community. However, Xena did have a number of male love interests as well throughout the series, and from the first season, she had an adversarial but sexually charged dynamic with Ares, the god of war, who frequently tried to win her over as his warrior queen. Regardless, some of the lesbian fanbase sees Xena and Gabrielle as a couple and has embraced them as lesbian icons. A group called the Marching Xenas has participated in many gay and lesbian pride parades. The question was left deliberately ambiguous by the writers during most of the show. And while we can argue that queerbaiting started to become a real problem in the 90s due to, again, say it with us, networks not wanting to piss off white suburban parents but still wanting the ratings, many fans felt that the sexual nature of Xena and Gabrielle's relationship was cemented by an interview given by Lucy Lawless to Lesbian News magazine in 2003. Lawless stated that after the series finale, where Gabrielle revived Xena with a mouth-to-mouth water transfer filmed to look like a full kiss, she had come to believe that Xena and Gabrielle's relationship was definitely gay. There was always a, well, she might be or she might not be, but when there was that drip of water passing between their lips in the very final scene, that cemented it for me. Now, it wasn't just that Xena was bisexual and kinda liked her gal pal and they kinda fooled around sometimes. It was, nope, they're married, man. Xena fans also popularized the term altfic, from alternative fiction, to refer to same-sex romantic fanfiction. Many fans felt the term /fiction carried the connotation of being about male couples only, and was not a good description for romantic fanfiction about Xena and Gabrielle. Queer science fiction nerds are the reason Tumblr ever existed at all. Now, it's hard to mention 90s LGBTQ+ speculative fiction in television without mentioning the incredible impact of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Like Xena before, Buffy was groundbreaking in its portrayal of complex female characters, as well as its portrayal of characters within the LGBTQ+ community without the use of queerbaiting. Buffy first aired in 1997, and by season 2, it had already featured its first out gay minor character, Larry Bagley III. In 1999, the show began exploring Willow Rosenberg's, Allison Hannigan's, sexuality and relationship with Tara McClay, Amber Benson, in season 4. There still wasn't much LGBTQ+ representation in mainstream media, especially not in the show's main cast of characters. The show's writers received a lot of negative pushback from the networks at the time for depicting an out lesbian relationship on screen, but nonetheless continued on to depict Tara and Willow's love in their own storylines and not as a throwaway. There were discussions among the Buffy the Vampire Slayer writers of making Willow bisexual given her relationship with Oz before he left and her previous crush on Xander. Whedon and the writers ultimately decided against portraying Willow as bisexual because they believed audiences needed to see Willow strictly identify as a lesbian, otherwise they may not fully accept her sexuality. As you can imagine, this wasn't well accepted by the bisexual community, but for the most part gave Buffy a pass for the sake of progress. In addition to the characters themselves, Buffy the Vampire Slayer featured many themes that related directly to the queer experience, such as struggling with parental acceptance, chosen family, and the running theme of being outcast by societal oppression. However well-intentioned the writers of Buffy may have been, they still committed the cardinal sin of most television shows that features one happy and in love gay couple ready to take on the world. In season 6 of the series, Buffy fell victim to one of the most devastating tropes that affect many LGBTQ+ characters on television. We're talking, of course, about the bury your gays trope, or perhaps, in this particular case, slay your gays. We've spoken about this issue often infecting the queer storylines of the 20th century, and Buffy was no exception. In short, bury your gays refers to when an LGBTQ+ character is killed off either to further the story or simply as the end of their narrative, a trend that harkens back decades to a time when LGBTQ+ were not allowed to have any sort of happy ending. In Season 6, Episode 19, titled Seeing Red, Tara was shot by Warren Mears, Adam Bush, in front of Willow, and her death sent Willow into a spiral that almost literally destroyed the world. It's not that character deaths on Buffy were unusual to create shock value, it's just an unfortunately common reality for television shows to feature LGBTQ+ characters just to kill them off for a dramatic catalyst. Since we are still walking a long path to get queer representation in mainstream media, and the LGBTQ+ community has faced insurmountable violence and discrimination in the past, this trope is an unfortunate stain on Buffy that did so much to push progress before it. Told you we'd come back to Star Trek. We've already touched on Star Trek's previous iterations taking a stab at queer issues and the Trekkies themselves really elevating queer identity into the canon. It wasn't until Deep Space Nine joined the chat from 1993 to 1999 that the queer community was satiated with true representation in the science fiction genre from the franchise. Deep Space Nine was, and still is, a show for the gays. To prove it, we didn't even write that line. It came from actual science fiction and gaming journalist Rhiannon Bevan. While The Next Generation tried its best with the Outcast episode, it was still painfully obvious the Don't Say Gay theme throughout was to keep censors off their backs. Deep Space Nine made up for it by featuring fully fleshed out queer story arcs, and recognized that gender identity and sexuality are not the same thing, nor are they dependent on one another. In the series premiere of DS9, we are introduced to Jadzia Dax, a Trill. A small percentage of the Trill population harbored a sentient lifeform known as a symbiont inside their bodies, a symbiotic relationship that played a significant role in Trill's culture and society. The, quote, joined Trill had personalities that were a combination of the two beings, and could access the memories and skills of previous hosts. Think Doctor Who, but, with a parasite. Okay, no, bad example. When the series starts, Jadzia has just recently become the host of the Dax symbiote, which was previously attached to a male Trill called Curzon. In DS9's early episodes, the crew members who knew Dax as Curzon adapted Jadzia as its new host, which has resonated with trans fans. Many speak highly of how even the mighty Klingon happily and easily accept her new identity, effortlessly using the correct name and pronouns when corrected. See, it's really not so hard, is it? Jadzia's arc as a trans allegory is only now receiving the kind of praise it should have gotten in the 90s. For some characters throughout the series, the connection between who Jadzia Dax is and who she was is a hard pill to swallow. The station's captain, Sisko, spends the vast majority of the show's run misgendering Jadzia, referring to her as Old Man. It's not until the show's final season, when a new host takes over the Dax symbiont, that he is finally called out over this and corrected on the fact that Old Man isn't really appropriate as a term. Jadzia also stood out by making another piece of Star Trek history, the first gay kiss. The fourth season episode, Rejoined, succeeds everywhere the Outcast falls flat. For starters, the couple in question are actually queer. Jadzia has to work with the wife of her previous host, and since she has all of his memories, she develops feelings for her too. However, it is strictly forbidden for Trill to be in a relationship with the same person as a previous host. It's not screaming, "this is homophobia" into the screen, but seeing the relationship as unproductive because they can't reproduce is written pretty clearly and loudly in the message. The episode ends with a forbidden kiss that both Trill society and the real world were outraged by. Jadzia is threatened by her people, as were the Star Trek writers at the time. Some southern states censored it completely. One of the writer's parents berated him for the episode, saying there should have been a warning before it aired. Similarly, in the episode itself, Lenara Khan, Jadzia's partner, is criticized by her brother for loving Jadzia. Dax is a paragon who, with regard to addressing gender in media. Dax speaks casually about how in her past lives she's been both a mother and a father, a husband and a wife. All of these identities make her who she is now as a woman. Despite the censorship debacle, DS9 still feels like a show written with respect for its queer fans. It was ahead of its time with its series-long storylines, fully fleshed arcs with relatable character development that had writers and producers that wanted to explore queerness within each episode, boldly going where no one else had gone before. There are literally film and gender studies courses devoted to discussing the Matrix and the queer allegory, so we won't do you the disservice of trying to give college credit by including it here. Released in 1999, the sci-fi, cyberpunk, kung fu fighting journey into the rabbit hole that is the Matrix introduced Western audiences to Eastern philosophies and filmmaking styles, and cemented our belief that Keanu Reeves is our universal untouchable boyfriend. Got it? Since its release, the film's directors, Lily and Lana Wachowski, have come out as trans, leaving many to wonder if the film subconsciously communicates a trans and or queer narrative throughout. Spoiler alert, it does. In 2020, Lily confirmed that the films were always meant to be an allegory for the trans experience. She told Netflix, "Neo has dysphoria, and the Matrix is the gender binary." She goes on to say, when the film was produced, the corporate world wasn't ready for more explicit queer movie narratives, but continued, "I love how meaningful these films are to trans people. I'm glad that it's gotten out that that was the original intention. Wachowski's predilection for fantasy, sci-fi, and being a filmmaker in general all come from her being trans. What is creating and playing in a world if not using your imagination to escape from a real world you don't fit into? The film's genre bending of kung fu, anime, western, science fiction, and cyberpunk genres also come from the Wachowski's transness and queerness. And in the film's most explicit expression of transness, Wachowski revealed the original plan for Switch, Belinda McClory, was for her to be a man in the Matrix and a woman in the real world. So when you inevitably see the far-right extremists on Twitter and Reddit quoting the Matrix all the time for some reason, you can laugh right along with us. Marvel Comics is frequently referred to as the House of Ideas, and despite Marvel's reputation as a hotbed for liberal, even subversive discourse, the company wouldn't feature a canonically gay character until 30 years or so after the debut of the Fantastic Four in the 1960s. There's a reason for that. We've touched on the 1954 Comics Code Authority before. For a very brief refresher, it was a censorship bureau that policed comics content and explicitly banned, quote, sex perversion, which comics scholar Hilary Shute notes is a clear reference to homosexuality. The Marvel Universe as we know it began in 1961 with the launch of Fantastic Four #1. Thus, Marvel Comics was, from the outset, actually prohibited from depicting gay characters due to the Comics Code of Authority. So, how do you write a queer character at a time when comics are expressly forbidden from featuring queer characters? It wasn't until 1992, 3 years after a major revision to the Comics Code officially opened the door to depictions of LGBTQ+ characters, that Marvel had their first openly gay superhero. In Alpha Flight number 106, written by Scott Lobdell, the character North Star, alias Olympic ski champion Jean-Paul Bobier, declared simply, "I am gay." 20 years later, North Star would also feature in Marvel's first same-sex marriage, an event that was prominently depicted on the cover of Astonishing X-Men number 51. North Star had debuted in 1983 as part of the all-Canadian government-sponsored superhero team Alpha Flight. The team first appeared in the pages of X-Men, brought to life by Canadian artist and writer John Byrne and iconic X-Men writer Chris Claremont. At the time, X-Men comics were already garnering queer readers with the very blatant subtext that being a mutant in this world suggested. Comic scholar Ramsey Fawaz notes that Claremont's X-Men articulated mutation to the radical critiques of identity promulgated by the cultures of women's and gay liberation. Another comic scholar, Scott Buchatman, puts it more simply, saying, "Mutant bodies are explicitly analogized to gay bodies in Claremont's X-Men." It's no surprise that Marvel's first gay superhero should emerge from this series. North Star's sexuality first breaches the surface in Alpha Flight number 7 in 1983, when he meets up with an old friend named Ramon, who is strongly hinted to be a former lover. In the story, written by Byrne, Ramon comments on North Star's good looks. He also references the secretive nature of his relationship with John Paul. "Then you've not really told your sister all about me, after all, John Paul. I thought that would have been odd." When Ramon is murdered, spoiler, sorry, North Star snaps with blind rage. The narrative caption tells us, "And Ramon had led him out of that dark fear, into the bright, clear light of self-acceptance." In 1983, the narrative of a former lover being murdered and thus spurring the superhero to action and emotional eruption was already a pretty established comics cliche, but doing so with a same-sex couple, though not explicitly stated of course, establishes a validation of North Star's relationship as something more. Shortly after, in the 1985 limited series X-Men and Alpha Flight, North Star's sexuality is once again brought into focus. After having his consciousness briefly absorbed by the X-Men Rogue, North Star becomes furious that she now knows his, quote, secrets. In a misguided attempt to help North Star, Rogue then asks him to dance at a very public reception. North Star's teammates make fun of him for dancing at a ball with a woman when John Paul takes Rogue up on the dance. She remarks, "You don't have to which he replies, "Yes, Rogue, I do." On the surface level, North Star is being ridiculed for his clear disinterest in the opposite gender. But Claremont is crafting a story of a man who struggles with his closeted sexuality in the face of social pressures. It's a sympathetic portrayal of the character that helps to normalize the concept of a gay superhero, even if Marvel couldn't identify him that way at the time. North Star holds a uniquely prominent and poignant position in the history of LGBTQ+ superheroes. As we come to understand the importance of diverse representation within the superhero genre, this is a character that needs to be known, discussed, and hopefully appreciated. And it's not like it would be any stretch of the imagination to include these queer heroes into the Marvelverse. Marvel has plenty of queer writers and artists openly expressing the desire to lend a brand new perspective to old stories. One of Marvel's most famous queer characters, the X-Men Bobby Drake, has been out as a gay man since 2015. And while there have been several solo Iceman titles that have explored his sexuality, it is still a big deal that a standalone X-Men comic features a discussion of Iceman's identity so prominently. X-Men number 14, written by Jerry Duggan with art by Carlos Villa and Matt Milla, take place during the Judgment Day event that has taken over most of Marvel Comics. Readers soon meet a journalist who has written an article about Bobby Drake saving the world that day, with the reporter's editor saying, "Lose the gay angle. Gay mutant hero. Does it really matter to the story?" The issue then flashes back to earlier in the day when a group of violent aliens have shot a flare generator into the Earth's sun, setting up a massive solar flare that will be an extinction-level event, at least until Iceman and the mutants stop the flare from destroying the Earth, of course. Using his incredibly powerful Omega-level mutant ability, Iceman is able to create an ice shield so thick and vast that it stops the outburst, saving humanity and all Earth. As Iceman descends to the planet, he gives a speech to the reporter as well as a crowd of clearly bigoted anti-mutant humans. He effectively uses the mutant metaphor by not just implying that his identity as a mutant is similar to his identity as a gay man, but actually making that connection out loud, creating a legitimate intersection between his two marginalized identities. And for many decades, X-Men has used the mutant metaphor as a security blanket to compare the discrimination of Marvel's mutants to real-world issues like racism, anti-Semitism, and homophobia. In X-Men number 14, Duggan uses the metaphor to enhance and affirm Bobby Drake's identity, not to make fun of it. Returning to the journalist, she tells her editor that he can take her article as is or not run it at all since Iceman just saved the world, and the least we can do is not erase his existence. She goes on to say, "I will not erase truth to coddle the small-minded." A beautiful sentiment about the power and necessity for queer representation. Okay, so trying to describe cyberpunk to someone that doesn't know or understand cyberpunk is like trying to squeeze water from a stone. You could just look to The Matrix or Blade Runner for help, but it's so much more than that. The origins of cyberpunk are rooted in the New Wave era science fiction movement of the 1960s and 1970s, when New Worlds magazine began inviting and encouraging stories that examined new writing styles, techniques, and archetypes. New Wave authors answered the call and attempted to present a world where society coped with a constant upheaval of new technology and culture with dystopian consequences. Writers like J.G. Ballard, Philip Jose Farmer, Samuel R. Delaney, and Harlan Ellison often examined the impact of drug culture, technology, and the sexual revolution with an avant-garde style influenced by the Beat Generation and Dadaism. Ballard attacked the idea that stories should follow the archetypes popular since the time of ancient Greece, and modern readers couldn't relate with the advancements of the modern world. Instead, Ballard wanted to write a new myth for the modern reader, a style with, quote, more psycho-literary ideas, more metabiological and metachemical concepts, private time systems, synthetic psychologies, and space-time, more of the somber half-worlds one glimpses in the paintings of schizophrenics. See what we mean? Yeah, water from a stone. Ballard's interpretation had a profound influence on a new generation of writers, some of whom would come to call their movement cyberpunk. Hugo Award-winning science fiction novelist Bruce Sterling later said, "In the circle of American science fiction writers of my generation, cyberpunks and humanists and so forth, Ballard was a towering figure. We used to have bitter struggles over who was more Ballardian than whom. We knew we were not fit to polish the man's boots, and we were scarcely able to understand how we could get to a position to do work which he might respect or stand, but at least we were able to see the peak of achievement that he had reached." Lawrence Person has attempted to define the content and ethos of the cyberpunk literary movement, stating, "Classic cyberpunk characters were marginalized, alienated loners who lived on the edge of society in generally dystopic futures where daily life was impacted by rapid technological change, an ubiquitous datasphere of computerized information, and invasive modification of the human body." And if this lack of bodily autonomy and outcast alien loners trope sounds a little familiar to our story, congratulations, you've been paying attention. Cyberpunk hit its peak in the 1990s for only having been a few decades old. One change that came at this time was the increase in the number of queer-identified authors with works that centered LGBT and/or queer protagonists published by large genre fiction publishers. Author Melissa Scott's best-known novels, Trouble and Her Friends in 1994, Point of Hopes in 1995, co-written with Lisa Barnett, and Shadow Man in 1995, ran the gamut from cyberpunk to science-influenced fantasy to science fiction exploring ideas about sex and gender. Trouble remains one of the few cyberpunk novels that featured a queer protagonist, while Shadow Man is still one of the few science fiction novels that explores cultural conflict based on the acceptance of people outside of the constructs of a binary gender system. Other out authors included Gail Baudino, whose fantasy novel Gossamer Axe in 1990 featured a bisexual, polyamorous female rock musician out to rescue her lover from the She. Laurie Marks created a post-apocalyptic fantasy with a lesbian couple as the protagonist in Dancing Jack in 1993. Nebula Award-winning author Savannah Park saw two critically acclaimed science fiction novels with lesbian protagonists, published Speaking Dreams in 1992 and Hand of Prophecy in 1998, both of which deal with issues of slavery, captivity, and the nature of freedom. Rachel Pollack and Richard Bowes created new kinds of urban fantasy in their novels. Pollack's Temporary Agency in 1994 and Godmother Night 1996 were set in a myth-influenced near future with demons, ritual magic, and queer protagonists. In contrast, Bowes' novel was set in a contemporary city and featured an alcoholic, gay hustler trying to get clean and gain control of his shadow alter ego. Anne Harris used a future cyberpunk version of Detroit as the backdrop for her novel about two female mutants who fall in love while dealing with the consequences of bioengineering in Accidental Creatures 1998. And we could continue for a while on the queer cyberpunk explosion of the 90s. While inspired by the world around it and the one that came before, it's one of the true speculative fiction genres that had free reign to explore and just be within the queer narrative. And this free reign would inevitably live to inspire film and TV and even video games of the 21st century. We know now that representation of the LGBTQ community in speculative fiction evolved over time, influenced by societal changes, audience engagement, and queer creatives being finally allowed a seat at the table to be involved in the narrative. It wasn't until the 2000s that we were finally able to make true visible change in our mainstream media. We began to see more leading roles within the gender and sexuality spectrum, and storylines focused less on queerness as being, quote, the other, and a composite in the entire story. Genres within the speculative fiction umbrella were able to branch out to places they hadn't been before, and characters were finally able to live freely out of the closet without fear of backlash, network cancellation, or boycotts, for the most part. The UK was a very different place in 1963. When Doctor Who first aired, it was illegal for two men to even be in a relationship in England and Wales until 1967. The law didn't apply to women. The show was conceived, scheduled, and advertised to address mixed adult and child audiences. British public service broadcasting is aimed to provide entertaining education programs for the public. Doctor Who claimed it met the criteria through its historical and scientific content, adventure, exploration, and its aim to target family audiences of different age groups, sexes, and social classes. By the 1980s, we started to see a change in the show for a modern era. Producer John Nathan Turner had spruced up the show with a flash of glamour and glitz, and this occasionally campy new sensibility increased its appeal to the LGBTQ+ community. In 1988, Doctor Who aired an episode titled The Happiness Patrol, which is so full of allegory that works on a few levels and resonates with fans of all kinds, and notably pissing off the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time. As much as the episode might be a criticism of the Conservative Party, The Happiness Patrol evokes Thatcher directly with Sheila Hancock's performance as Helen A. The episode calls out Section 28, a policy which banned the promotion of gay themes in schools, and the persecution of gay men by the police. This was solidified by what might be politely described as a less than subtle production design, which had all female characters sporting bright pink wigs. Amazing. After all, this was an era where James Anderton, the chief constable of the Manchester Police, could get away with stating that the gay community was, quote, swirling in a cesspool of their own making. Thatcher herself came out with similarly bigoted remarks in saying that, quote, children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay. All of those children are being cheated of a sound start in life. Yes, cheated. It's no surprise that the show was put on pause in 1989 due to low ratings, and didn't fully come back until 2005. And listen, we know that there was the 8th Doctor in 1996, okay, but for this context, it's a moot point to bring him up. In 2005, the Doctor had returned with a new showrunner in Russell T Davies, who had created Doctor Who fan Vince Tyler for Queer as Folk, and he introduced the world to a new set of characters, including one dashingly handsome and queer Captain Jack Harkness. Jack was a rogue time agent who, in the 9th episode of the new series, meets the Doctor and Rose in wartime London and quickly joins them aboard the TARDIS. The traditional boundaries of sexuality absolutely did not apply to Jack, and he makes this very clear throughout his time on the show. While the Doctor and Rose were always in a will they, won't they type of relationship, Jack preferred a more direct approach and kissed them both. He'd later have a relationship with his Torchwood colleague Yanto Jones, and was left devastated after his death.
Back at it again with the bury your gays trope, we see.
But he did bounce back with a budding relationship with Alonzo Frame by his final episode of the series. It's important to note that Jack was the first openly queer character in the history of Doctor Who, and brazenly so. There was no episode dedicated to understanding his queerness. He just was. The popularity of the character among audiences directly influenced the development of the spin-off series Torchwood, for which Jack was the lead. As an ongoing depiction of bisexuality in mainstream British television, the character became a role model for young gay and bisexual people in the UK and around the world. And listen, we could theoretically break down Doctor Who LGBTQ visibility all day. Not only did the show include many reoccurring queer characters like FBI agent Canton Delaware III and Madame Vastra, the companions had their fair share of queer storylines as well. It was insinuated more than once that companion Claire Oswald had a, quote, thing with Jane Austen. By the time the Doctor had his 12th reincarnation, he had Bill Potts, his first companion who was exclusively and explicitly interested in dating other women. Now we're almost all caught up, at the very opposite end of the rainbow to where we started in 1963. In 2018, we were introduced to the 13th Doctor, who also happened to be a woman. The context being that the Doctor is a being who is beyond the binary. While this Doctor uses she/her pronouns, we are reminded of her past through the eyes of this new incarnation, with memories of the many Doctors' experiences and relationships before her. And the series was generally very LGBTQ friendly. With her companions Yaz, Graham, and Ryan, they came across a pregnant man and encountered a gay security guard talk about his boyfriend, before being exterminated. The romance between Yaz and the 13th Doctor was finally confirmed in the 2022 New Year's Day special, when Dan, John Bishop, confronted Yaz about her unsaid feelings towards the Doctor. It's not perfect, and there's still a long ways to go, but queer and straight fans alike have been proud of the progress the show has made in its 60-year reign. Superhero fiction is a whale of its own in our media universe. Its battle with the LGBTQ+ community has its own trials and tribulations, and we've only scraped the surface here with a peep into the Marvel universe. It only seems fair we see how DC has opened its doors to the queer community. One of the greatest examples comes with the reintroduction to Batwoman to our heroic lexicon in the 21st century. Development on a Batwoman series began in 2018, after it was announced that Kate Kane would appear in the Arrowverse crossover Elseworlds. Ruby Rose was cast as Kate the same year, with Batwoman receiving a full series order in 2019. Shortly after the season 1 finale, Rose exited the series, and Javicia Leslie was cast as Ryan, an original character created to succeed Kate. Batwoman broke new ground as being the first live-action superhero series with an openly gay lead character. Credit to this progressive choice can be given partially for the two leads who have taken up the mantle. Ruby Rose identifies as gender fluid and a lesbian. Javicia Leslie is the first black woman in the role and the first bisexual woman. The show's synopsis describes out lesbian Kate Kane as having, quote, a passion for social justice and a flair for speaking her mind, while her alter ego Batwoman is a highly trained street fighter primed to snuff out the failing city's criminal resurgence. But before she can become the hero that Gotham City needs, Kate has her own demons to overcome. In the first season of the CW series, in an episode titled How Queer Everything Is Today, the caped superhero, Ruby Rose, struggles whether to divulge her sexuality to the world because she fears that it will unveil her true identity as Kate Kane. But after meeting a queer teenager whose parents doesn't accept her sexual identity, Batwoman decides to publicly come out in an interview with Kara Danvers, aka Supergirl, played by Melissa Benoist, for Catco magazine. Showrunner Carolyn Dries told Entertainment Weekly at the time that Batwoman/Kate Kane is so comfortable with who she is and so comfortable with being truthful. So it was important for the character to, quote, stand in her truth. And while DC is still guilty of queerbaiting their live-action Harley Quinn starring Margot Robbie, it's important to note just how monumental it is that the animated series wholeheartedly dives into Quinn and Poison Ivy's relationship, allowing queer characters to shine as the main plot. Since the early days of Batman, the animated series, we've seen a strong bond between best friends and just roommates, Harley Quinn and Poison Ivy. In Jimmy Palmiotti and Amanda Connor's Harley Quinn number 25, Harley and Ivy shared their first on-panel kiss, finally validating their previous subtextual queer relationship decades in the making. In the animated series Harley Quinn, the show finds success taking its time building the relationship between Harley and Ivy, with the pilot establishing that Ivy and Harley are best friends. After years of warning signs, Ivy is finally able to convince Harley to break off her toxic relationship with the Joker. The writers delicately make sure Ivy isn't just a rebound for Harley. The first season doesn't focus on Ivy and Harley's romantic relationship, but instead on their friendship. It's not until the second season that the relationship blossoms. In the episode There's No Place to Go But Down, Ivy and Harley are sent to, quote, the pit, an inescapable prison run by Bane. Though, of course, not even a pit of despair is going to stop Harley and Ivy from coming up with a plan to escape. In the end, Ivy proves her loyalty to Harley by risking her own life to save her best friend. In the heat of the moment, Harley and Ivy share an intense kiss. The romantic feelings for each other sneak up on them, exploring the messy emotions that come along with falling in love. Harley accepts that she has feelings for Poison Ivy, but Ivy does not. Ivy doesn't want to ruin the friendship she has with Harley just because she fears that if they become something more, Harley's personality will only end up breaking her heart, ruining the most sacred relationship she has in her life. Harley Quinn Season 2 is incredibly queer, complex, and to the sigh of relief to queer fans, there is no real coming out story. Thank God. And truth be told, Harley Quinn doesn't need it. There's never a moment in the series that Harley or Ivy have to, quote, come out. But that doesn't mean their queerness is erased either. There's even a moment when Harley tries to lighten the mood and tells Ivy, you're here, you're queer, get used to it. Harley Quinn is a testament not only to how the comics and accompanying media should handle Harley and Ivy's relationship, but also how other TV shows should tell their queer storylines as a statement of fact, rather than a desperate attempt of inclusion. Horror fiction is another subgenre of speculative fiction intended to scare, unsettle, and horrify the audience. Historically, the cause of the horror experience has often been the intrusion of a disturbing supernatural element into everyday human experience. Since the 1960s, any work of fiction with a morbid, gruesome, surreal, or exceptionally suspenseful or frightening theme has come to be called, quote, horror. But horror has a way of reflecting real life inside its allegory that most other genres can't get away with. What do we mean by this? Well, the relationship between gay fiction and horror is often attributed to the Gothic novels of the 1790s and early 1800s. LGBTQ horror publisher and general editor James Jenkins offered that the traditional explanation for the gay horror connection is that it was impossible for them to write openly about gay themes back then, or the idea of being gay as an identity didn't even exist. So they sublimated them and expressed them in more acceptable forms, using the medium of a transgressive genre like horror fiction. Early works with clear gay subtext include Matthew Lewis's The Monk, 1796, and both Charles Maturin's The Fatal Revenge, 1807, and Melmoth the Wanderer, 1820. Influential and controversial entries in the genre include the lesbian vampire novella Carmilla, 1872, by Sheridan Le Fanu, and The Picture of Dorian Gray in 1890 by, of course, Oscar Wilde, which shocked readers with its sensuality and overtly gay characters. Richard S. Primuth of the Gay and Lesbian Review Worldwide writes that Stoker, a closeted gay man and close friend of Oscar Wilde, began writing Dracula just as Wilde was sentenced to hard labor after his conviction for sodomy. Talia Schaefer writes in ELH that Dracula explores Stoker's fear and anxiety as a closeted homosexual man during Oscar Wilde's trial. This peculiar tonality of horror derives from Stoker's emotions at this unique moment in gay history. Though the Hays Code prohibited LGBTQ+ characters or themes during its entire existence from 1930 to 1968, certain films like Dracula's Daughter, 1936, and The Haunting, 1963, pushed the envelope by showing what they could, within the guidelines, queer code so that gays and lesbians could see it, but those who chose to ignore it, well, still could as well. Queer horror got a boost with the advent of the pulp novel in the 20th century, and in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, more general widespread acceptance of the LGBTQ+ community allowed more explicitly queer characters to be added to horror stories. Jennifer's Body, released in 2009, written by Diablo Cody, fresh off her Oscar win for Juno, stars Megan Fox, an out bisexual woman, and Amanda Seyfried. Jennifer's Body is considered horror and dark comedy filled with campy dialogue and oozing gore. It's a film of, quote, almost, that just gets better with age. It's almost a queer love story. It's almost a vampire movie. It's almost a feminist manifesto. It tells the story of popular cheerleader Jennifer, played by Megan Fox, who is accidentally turned into a man-eating demon by a band of power-hungry men. Her loyal best friend, Needy, Seyfried, is strung along as Jennifer begins to devour the male inhabitants of their town. During its release, the movie was considered a critical and commercial bust, earning a mere $16.2 million at the US box office, and the scorn of critics and audiences alike. The dialogue was considered poorly written, and it seemed the marketed audience of teenage boys did not care for the queer-coded friendship and allegory about sexual violence. But in recent years, particularly after the rise of the #MeToo movement, the horror film has taken on cult status with the help of its queer fan base. Although Baird and many others felt their sexualities were represented in the film, neither of the main characters are explicitly queer. There are a few sexual references throughout the film. Jennifer says that she, quote, goes both ways, for example. There's also a kiss between Needy and Jennifer as the latter spirals deeper into darkness. But queer fans say the film resonates because of more than just its sexual undertones. The influx of new queer fans has broadened the conversation of queer representation in the film. And what we expect of queer films, according to Rowan Ellis, co-host of the Queer Movie Podcast, you can definitely read Jennifer's Body as a very obsessive female friendship that a lot of queer people can probably see reflected in their own relationships, said Ellis. It also dissects the allegory of sexual violence, as well as how its failures coincides with Fox's experiences of sexism in Hollywood. While Jennifer's Body has a large queer following, it doesn't necessarily claim to be queer. Likewise, the erotic metaphor of vampirism, inspired by Carmilla, results in the seemingly never-ending obsession with vampires in film and literature. That is, let's just face it, really gay. Looking at you, True Blood. Author James R. Keller writes that in particular, gay and lesbian readers have been quick to identify with the representation of the vampire, suggesting its experiences parallel those of the sexual outsider. Richard Dyer discusses the recurring homoerotic motifs of vampire fiction in his article Children of the Night, primarily the, quote, necessity of secrecy, the persistence of a forbidden passion, and the fear of discovery. With the vampire having been a recurring metaphor for same-sex desire from before Stoker's Dracula, Dyer observes that historically earlier representations of vampires tend to evoke horror, and later ones turn that horror into celebration. The homoerotic overtones of Anne Rice's celebrated The Vampire Chronicles from 1976 to 2018 are well documented, and its publication reinforced the widely recognized parallel between the queer and the vampire. Horror has and continues to allow these queer metaphors to exist right in front of our faces without ever really realizing what it's doing until it's too late. It's what makes it a universal genre rich with context for fans across all identities. To round out the most progressive turn for media and queer representation in the 21st century, you might be surprised to know it's not in film, TV, or literature at all. That's right, we're talking about video games, particularly science fiction video games. The history of trans people in video games is a long and complicated one. The community has been subject to depictions of all kinds: good, bad, well-intentioned but misguided, the butt of a joke, etc. Trans people are often seen as villains, or at the very least, background characters. It's rare the trans community see themselves as the playable hero or the love interest. It's impossible to speak on inclusion of trans characters in video games without acknowledging these complexities. Not only do the depictions of trans people trend towards negative, they're also often deeply ambiguous. Trans people are frequently conflated with cross-dressing or drag queens and confused with people who are gender non-conforming or intersex, and depictions are mired in misinformation frequently. These depictions can be further compounded by their origins. A good number of the characters across this list originate from Japan, which has a different history with LGBTQ culture. Identity is often lost in translation, or erased entirely, for North American and European markets. The Final Fantasy series has an extensive record of characters that appear as gender non-conforming or even trans. As a minor antagonist in Final Fantasy VIII, Adele is muscular and tall and was once feared world over. As with others, the intention behind her portrayal is unclear. The English version depicts her as female, but the original Japanese dialogue doesn't indicate a gender. In French, references to Adele are both masculine and feminine. Morpheus Duval is the primary antagonist of Resident Evil Dead Aim, who is obsessed with beauty. When he mutates after infecting himself with a variant of the T-virus, he becomes a feminine creature. Obsessed with beauty and perfection, despite it being depicted as allegedly unattainable, is one way that trans women are often devalued and stereotyped. While wanting to be beautiful crops up frequently, it's not always followed up with that character turning into a grotesque monster that has to be destroyed. So it's nice when video games within the genre have had the foresight to include trans characters with meaningful character developments, jobs, heartbreak, fails, and wins, just like every other character that's ever been created. When it comes to science fiction, fantasy, and horror fiction video games, trans characters have had a renaissance in the last decade. The Last of Us Part 2, released June 19, 2022, has been described as groundbreaking for being a big-budget game from a major developer with several lead characters who are queer. There's Lev, a trans boy escaping religious persecution, Ellie, a lesbian, is one of the game's protagonists, and Dina, Ellie's love interest and fighting partner, has romantic relationships with men and women. And this is a major spoiler here, so fast forward 15 seconds if you don't want to have the game ending ruined. But very important to the narrative to say that none of these queer characters die in the end. The game's director, Neil Druckmann, vice president of its developmental studio Naughty Dog, said the addition of LGBTQ storylines in the highly anticipated game was a part of exploring new perspectives to give players a rich and diverse world. Druckmann said he wants players to, quote, see the perspective of people that have different identities, different sexual attractions, they come from different countries, and explore how the characters react if you plop them in this world. While The Last of Us Part 2 has moved forward the needle of inclusivity and representation in video games, it has also gotten blowback from some critics and players for its storytelling choices around the portrayal of Lev. Druckmann, however, said some missteps are inevitable when you're in largely uncharted territory. Fair point. Lastly, one of our personal favorite takes on the cyberpunk genre come from CD Projekt's Cyberpunk 2077, and it's not just because of Keanu Reeves, although Keanu Reeves is awesome. In the game, it is entirely up to the individual player to choose how their character expresses their sexuality. However, we can explore how different characters might approach this question in the context of the game world. In the world of Cyberpunk 2077, sexuality is no longer a taboo subject. In a future where technology has advanced to the point where people can change their physical appearance and enhance their bodies with cybernetic implants, sexuality is just another aspect of identity that can be explored and expressed. For some characters, their sexuality might be a defining part of their identity. For others, it might be something they keep hidden from the world. And for others still, it might be something they are still exploring and trying to understand for themselves. Regardless of how a character approaches their sexuality, there's no judgment in the world of Cyberpunk 2077. And why should there be? People are free to express themselves however they see fit, and there's no shame or stigma attached to any particular sexual orientation. So you can absolutely be gay in Cyberpunk 2077, and you can be anything else you want to be too. Just remember one thing: Sky is the girl, and Angel is the guy. Speculative fiction is a powerful medium for both queer audiences and writers alike, because it empowers narratives and characters that disrupt our worldview for the better. While some speculative fiction may be dystopian, it may also give us hope for a better future. Speculative fiction has long been a safe haven for queer representation, and though it has not come without challenges, setbacks, learning curves, and really weird sagas, we do owe a lot to the genre and its subgenres for expanding past the binary, so to speak, where other mainstream media has failed. Our world has changed a lot since Mary Shelley released Frankenstein in 1818, and our media, along with our perspective, has had to change with it. And while there's no end in sight for progress that can and should be made for the genre correcting past wrongs, one thing is very clear: the future is queerness's domain.